covering is virtual professional research certification. This differs from the certification we did in the fall in that this one focuses primarily on practical research. So this program was developed by law librarians in law firms, by advice and insight from partners and assigning attorneys as well. We're going to start by reviewing the hypo. I've actually provided the hypo in the email that I've sent to you, so I won't belabor the point by reading all that. Short and simple, we have a basic research problem, much like we do any research assignment, that's going to guide how we attack this problem. So in essence, we're trying to see if a potential client has a claim under the Fair Housing Act for harassment by their neighbor, particularly for their religious proclivities. So as we go forward, this is going to be slightly different than a topic that you have no idea about in that we have a citation to a statute. So whenever you have a citation to a statute, that's the kind of one time that you deviate from the general research process of starting with research with secondary sources rather. So what we're going to do is simply start by entering the citation into the red search box and pulling it up this way. When you enter the citation, it will take you directly to that document. So in this case, a particular statute. If, however, it doesn't take you to a statute and rather gives you a results list, say like 3 or 4 options, that usually happens because the statute is so big, particularly with the United States Code. And it's not actually the language of the statute that's going to be too big, but it's going to be the annotations associated with it. So for instance, let's go down. So we have the language of the statute. Unlawful to interfere, coerce, or intimidate a person in the enjoyment of their home. So we're going to come down here, select case notes. And this gives us a nice kind of topical breakdown of how this statute has been applied by the courts and interpreted by the courts. So we can find our particular breakdown, if you will, so relation to other laws, for instance, and drop down and look at a sampling of the cases that apply this statute as it relates to other laws. This is what can create a statute to be too large to be encompassed in one results list. In that case, when you pull up a citation and it takes you to, those 3 or 4 entries, look under the link, like the name or the heading of the statute, and it'll say part 1 of 3, part 2 of 3. The language of the statute will always be the same. It's actually just these annotations that are going to be different. So just be aware of that. Along these lines, these annotations are so fantastic because they really give you a jump start on how this statute has been applied by the courts, rather than just beginning your own kind of open-ended search into case law. It's also the distinction between the United States Code Service, which is on Lexis, and the United States Code, which is, of course, the official publication that the Blue Book has you cite to. All right, now let's scroll back up to the top real quick. And we are going to take a look at a few other things before we leave this section. So we have the law, and this is the law, and that's all great. But before we cite to any authority or rely upon any authority, we always have to shepherdize that authority. And we shepherdize for 2 main reasons. The first reason is we want to validate, right? Make sure it's still good law. But as we see here, this green diamond with the plus symbol means there is no negative history. Not only does it mean there's no negative history, there's positive history. So we really don't even need to do anything to validate this particular statute because that green symbol tells me, yes, it's fine. But we do want to shepherdize for the second reason, which is to expand your analysis. So we have this statute, but we're going to expand this out and look at a couple of things. The first thing we're going to look at, and we come here to other citing sources, and this is going to be everything that is in a case that cites to this statute. And we're coming here specifically to narrow down to those secondary materials, so law reviews, treatises, although we can link into a number of other things from here as well. And we're first going to narrow down to law reviews. And this is the reason I say when you have a statute, you kind of don't need to start anywhere else other than the statute, because simply shepherdize the statute will take you to those secondary sources. From here, we can enter additional terms to make this results list more meaningful. So we're looking at 83 results right now, but our particular factual scenario is really dealing with post-acquisition. So we're simply going to narrow down to post-acquisition. Those were also some words we picked up in those annotations we were looking at. And that brings us down to 16. So only 16 law review articles that mention this statute also have language about post-acquisition. So then we'll just kind of peruse through here looking for different articles that might be relevant for us to help kind of guide our understanding of this law and lead us to that black letter law. And sure enough, neighbor on neighbor harassment, does the Fair Housing Act make a federal case out of it? Well, that seems like right on point, exactly what we're looking for. So rather than just reinventing the wheel, starting the research on our own, we can just come here and see what the author of this article has had to say about it. We can also skip around to the more important parts for our purposes. So I'm going to come to the navigation for terms, and I want to look specifically at what the Fair Housing Act says about post-acquisition and its protections. And as we come here, we see Halperin dealt with the plaintiff's claim. Posner ruled that this claim could proceed, but only because a HUD regulation interpreting 3617 purported to extend it to post-acquisition situations. So it sounds like the actual statute isn't providing for post-acquisition, but the regulation has extended. So that's great. It's kind of fleshing out the law for us. And then even though this article is not the law, it does cite back to primary law. So we're going to use the footnotes to jump down to them. And we have the case, we have the regulation, and of course we already have the statute as well. So really giving us a plethora of content to deal with. All right, now we're going to jump back to the Shepherd's report. And we, of course, shampoo, rinse, repeat until we had a good understanding out of these secondary sources. And then what we're going to do is jump over to citing decisions. So citing decisions are what most people think of when they think of a Shepherd's report. More specifically, all those cases that cite back to the underlying authority that we're looking at. And we are going to narrow down in a couple of meaningful ways. If I was doing this in the real world, what I would do is narrow down to the circuit I'm sitting in, which for our purposes of the hypo is going to be the Fourth Circuit. But I would also say select multiple to include both the Supreme Court and the Fourth Circuit. But that's not what the quiz does, so we're just simply going to say the Fourth Circuit for right now. And then we're now looking at all the Fourth Circuit opinions that cite to this statute, but we're going to make it even more meaningful by narrowing the terms that are mentioned in the case. So we're simply going to say harassment within 10, of neighbor, and narrow. So what this is saying is, all right, I only want the cases that mention neighbor within 10 words of harassment, and we have one result. This happens to be the answer to a quiz question, but if I was doing this in the real world, what I would probably do is edit my terms to broaden them out a bit, so harassment and neighbor. That way I have some more meaningful results, right? Like one's a good case if it's right on point, but you might want to look at a little broader perspective, if you will. Alrighty. So we got a good foundation of case law. Now what we're going to do is move on to kind of a big, broad search. So we've got started with that statute that's led us to some secondary sources, but let's just start kind of throwing a wider net, if you will. And we're simply going to say neighbor harassment, Fair Housing Act. Now this is going to run a natural language search. If my results were too cumbersome, too unwieldy, too many, I can tweak this by adding a connector. So then I might say neighbor and harassment and Fair Housing Act to give me less results because it would require the system to find each of those terms. But because I'm doing it as a natural language with no connectors, it's going to find any variation of these terms, but it is going to pre-populate the most relevant using our proprietary algorithm to pull those most relevant terms up to the top, or cases up to the top. So now what we're going to do is we're going to move on down to administrative codes and regulations. So remember, when you're searching primary law, there are really four big buckets we want to look in. Cases and statutes, which we all know about, but maybe less, gets less attention, but are sometimes even more important, are regulations and administrative materials. So to get to those regulations, we're going to come here to administrative codes and regulations. And then the feature that I like to use the most on this category is sources. We could say category, And we can specifically say administrative codes, which are going to give us those actual codified regulations. But we know we're dealing with a federal issue, so we know we want to look at the federal regulations, and we can simply say CFR, Code of Federal Regulations, to narrow it down to just those materials. Now it's going to give us this results list with that algorithm pre-populating up at the top, those most relevant results. But we could tweak this even more if we wanted to. So we have 1,500, so that's still quite a few results. So we're going to say search within results, post acquisition and religious discrimination. Run the search. It's going to weed them down to just one. So we'll go ahead and open up this one section, this one relevant regulation, and we'll actually probably see that this was the regulation that law review article looked at that we had referred to just a few minutes ago. So a regulation, of course, mimics that of a statute in that it kind of breaks it down by subsection for us. Note, of course, you've got the same features of the statute and that we can also come down to the case notes to see how this regulation has been applied to different cases and decisions, broken down topically once again. So more kind of relevant information. And then, of course, the last thing we want to do is shepherdize it. And we can quickly see there is this red exclamation point. This is the equivalent of a red stop sign for a case. So we know there is some problem with this particular authority. So we definitely need to validate, shepherdize to validate. So we're going to click shepherdize and take us to the Shepherd's report. And we see here some portion of this regulation has been held void or invalid. So a quick cheat to ascertain what is creating that is to click this subsection report by specific court citation. What that's going to do is take this Shepherd's report and break it down by subsections. And we can take a look at this Shepherd signal, blue just means neutral, to see what created the problem. And sure enough, number 6 is 100.400C2. So C2 is the actual subsection that's been held void or invalid. We could also click on that and it would take us to the 54 opinions that cite back to this to ascertain which of those created that negative analysis. But that is not actually what the quiz asks us to do. So what we are going to do instead is come down here and look for additional cases within the 10th Circuit. So we'll narrow down, select the 10th Circuit. Now we're looking at jurisdictionally appropriate cases that cite back to our regulation. So we'll go ahead, jump into that opinion, and see what it has to say about this regulation and how it applies it. All right, we are getting there. So now what we're going to do is go back to our original search results. The quickest way to do that is to come to History and grab that first search. That's going to be the very last search that you ran, so it's going to take you back to the original search screen in case you've clicked, 3 or 4 places away from your search screen.